Welcome to Pensar Basketball Live. We're going to be talking about the Toronto Raptors rebuild, allegedly in year one. This is ground zero. This team is supposed to be awful, right? I don't think they're supposed to be awful. I've been railing about it for the last 3, 4 months that I just simply refuse to believe that this team is as bad as the media and as NBA analysts want them to be. And so the modest expectation is 30 to 34 wins. And that is a really bad place to be. But there are some extenuating circumstances that are going to push the Raptors either up or down. And I think that if you're a Raptor fan who is worried that this team is going to end up in the middle of nowhere, I really do think that there's evidence to suggest that that will not be the case. That this team is either going to be bottom six or they're going to make the playoffs. Now, development is a funny thing. People clown it, people don't talk about it. We love to talk about transactions because we can see it. Karl Anthony Towns going to New York. We can see that. We don't need to project what type of player Karl Anthony Towns is going to be because he's already a multi-time All-Star. And had the Toronto Raptors traded for Karl Anthony Towns, I'm pretty sure the prognosis and the projections for how good this team would be very different. Maybe if the Toronto Raptors had traded a few of those picks for a complete win now player like a Cam Johnson, the projections would be different. But right now, all these young players, all of these second draft guys like Ochai Abaji, Davion Mitchell, young players like Jamal Shead, Jacoby Walter, Jonathan Mogbo are just unproven hypotheticals. And you can be bullish on them, you can be bearish on them, but what is clear is that everything is being operated in a particular vision. Now, I spent a good deal of last live, which was a pretty long live, so I don't expect anyone to have heard it. So I'll repeat myself a little bit here. Looking back at the three iterations of the Toronto Raptors that really surprised and maybe exceeded expectations, which were the 06-07 Raptors with Chris Bosh, the 13-14 Raptors with Kyle Lowry, and then, of course, there were the 2021-2022 Raptors that won 48 wins. That's 47 wins, and 48 wins. Those teams were not supposed to be at the top of the Atlantic Division or anywhere near it in the preseason. They massively exceeded expectations. And in almost every single case that that happened, the coach that did it was given I believe at least two of those times the coach was given or the executive was given an award like coach of the year, executive of the year, etc. Anytime a team does that, there tends to be a rewriting of history like, oh, well, this coach must be the best coach in the world. Yeah, Dwayne Casey was surely the best coach in the world. He got fired right after winning his coach of the year. Brian Colangelo was certainly the best executive in the league that year. These awards are stupid because what we don't see is we don't see the iceberg. We know the iceberg that hit the Titanic, but we don't see what's underneath the iceberg. And since iceberg videos are so common, I think the iceberg is the perfect analogy for what the Toronto Raptors are doing. Because again, what the Raptors did last year with four major transactions, pieces coming in and out of the lineup, two of, if not their only two really, really positive defenders in Scotty Barnes and Jakob Poeltl, missing considerable amounts of time. Players like Emmanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett, perhaps being pushed into roles and suboptimal offensive roles that really did not cater to their strengths, but rather address their weaknesses. You had players like Jalen McDaniels, Gary Trent Jr., early on, Grady Dick, that were such overwhelming negatives that simply those players not existing and you playing higher minutes would have addressed so many of the concerns. And then, of course, the last 25 games were a straight on tankathon. So I understand that some people have this irrational, well, let's say it's not irrational, but habitual idea that 25 wins is supposed to turn into 32 wins and 32 wins is supposed to go to 40 wins, but every season starts anew. Okay. And I just don't think that people fairly account for what good development teams are supposed to look like, but we've seen it before. Kentucky doesn't have as many national championships as their reputation as a blue blood would suggest that they should have. They've had some of the best one and done prospects in NCAA history come through their ranks. And of course, Kentucky has a very different focus than Oregon and UCLA and other programs like that. Kentucky's focus, if I may just allude to this, because I did allude to it with the previous video that we did with Eric, was to put players in a position where they'll be better 5 years down the line for what they're doing now. And so that means that a lot of Kentucky guards are going to struggle. All right. You're not going to see the best version of those players because those players are not necessarily being put into positions to be the best version of themselves. What they're doing is building them up slowly. And so, yeah, what the Raptors are doing right now in training camp is implementing this very high pickup point and trying to guard full court. Well, guess what? That's development. Now, one of the underrated parts of the Toronto Raptors' second unit being so defensively oriented, specifically the guard and pickup points of guys like Ochai Abaji and Davion Mitchell. Well, imagine what those practices are going to be like. This is a super underrated part. And if you are paying attention, you'll know that the Raptors did this with the bench mob. Fred Van Vliet as a backup guard, DeLon Wright, backup guard, Pascal Siakam on the backup unit. Occasionally, you had OG Anunoby, playing with the second unit as well. These guys are incredible defenders. And so when your stars have to go up against incredible defenders every single night, I think that that naturally propels them to be better. If Emmanuel quickly has to be guarded by Jamal Shead and Davion Mitchell every single night, in practice, well, he's not going to be all that surprised when he goes into a game against John Wall. Sorry, not John Wall, De'Aaron Fox. He's not going to be all that. I mean, he's still going to have an adjustment when he comes up to Jalen Suggs and perhaps Drew Holiday, but it's not going to be as big an adjustment as it otherwise would be. This sharpens your tools. Playing against good players sharpens your tools. So let's talk about what really it takes to build a great development culture. Number one is culture, just the culture of selflessness, which is what is basically being talked about coming out of training camp. The vibes are great. The energy is light. This is not what the Raptors were like last year with Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby, their pending future being the dominating talk. Pascal Siakam talking about, I think there was a quote from Pascal Siakam a few games into the season of like, well, whatever team I'm on, etc. The ego stuff is just gone, right? There's nobody here who has that what's my next team mentality. Like your core guys are all locked up long term. You know, Jakob Pertl, a lot has been made of his comments. I think his comments were perfectly fine. His comments of we're not going to go out and try to win every single game. Look, when you get comments like that coming out of Jakob, who is, perhaps the oldest member of the core of this team, and then you have Masai Ujiri talking about rebuild. You have Darko Rajakovic talking about building a house, and we're just putting in the basement, and this is year one of the rebuild. You'd be excused for thinking this is going to be an awful season, right? Andre Lee saying, "You think Scotty's personal life might impact his game?" No. What? No, not at all. Okay. So when we talk about building a culture, the culture of selflessness, the culture of moving the ball, all that stuff was implemented last year. I don't understand why this is being branded as year one of the rebuild because the pieces were already put in from the minute Darko took over, which is last summer, right? He had the entire summer to work with Scotty. He had the entire summer to work with a lot of the guys who were on that team. And granted, a lot of the guys who are now on the team right now weren't on the team back then. But still, Scotty was, Yak was. So these guys have had a chance to really be a part of the system. They understand what the Raptors are doing. And then you have to take into consideration just how much the Raptors have improved already. RJ Barrett has been a phenomenal, phenomenal success story. I mean, if you look at his analytical charts from New York, even the best year in New York, which was year two, to what he was as a Toronto Raptor and what he was with Team Canada, you can already see the development. If you have seen anything of the Raptors practices, and I encourage you to, go check out Esfandiar Barahani S, on Twitter, and he's sharing like Darko working with Ochai and Darko working with Grady and the coaches working with Ulrich. This is something that we've seen before in Raptors land. We saw it with Dwayne Casey. We saw it with Jama. We saw it with Patrick Mutombo. We saw this type of development. The underrated part of development is that one player who is maybe a fringe rotation player getting 10% better is not something that we are accustomed to projecting properly. Everyone can project that Cooper Flag is going to be a franchise player, even though the jury is still out on that. Anyone can say, "Oh, you drafted Cade Cunningham, problem solved now." People are way less less equipped mentally to say, this Reggie Bullock guy, this Contavious Caldwell Pope guy, this JJ Redick guy, these guys are going to be valuable contributors someday. This Jimmy Butler guy that we picked at 30th, this is going to be something good, right? If you want to sort the Toronto Raptors' current roster into two lumps, let's sum it up. On the one side, and this is why I am super optimistic about this season. I'll give you more reasons for being optimistic, but I'll give you like one big one. Let's say the Raptors are a little bit better than the analysts project. And they don't have to be a lot better, because if the projection is 30 to 34 wins, a little bit better just means on track for 38 wins. Okay. So let's just say the Raptors are a little bit better than expected. Scotty's a little bit better. RJ's a little bit better. The defense is a little bit better. Yak is a little bit more healthy. You know, Bruce Brown is in for a redeem season because he's in a contract year. Kelly Olynyk is back to his old self and he's more implemented and integrated. Okay, so some good things happen. Grady's taking a step up. That's the thing with young players is what they say. Development is not linear. So you don't know when that big jump is going to come, and you have 8 guys where you don't know where that big jump is going to come. So, okay, maybe you don't have a lot of faith in Ochai. Maybe you don't have a lot of faith that Jacoby Walter is going to take a step this year. Maybe you don't think Ulrich Shamshay is going to play any meaningful minutes in the NBA for the last 2 years. Is there a chance that Jonathan Mogbo could be a rotation player out the gate? That changes your calculus completely, because right now he's not projected to be one. Is it possible that Davion Mitchell, just with a coach like Darko, actually figures it out? Like, I'm not overly high on Davion. I've never been high on Davion. But the focus that I'm hearing from him on an off-ball defender, I'm like, oh my God. Like, if this guy figures out the off-ball defense part, he's already physically one of the best equipped point guard defenders in the league. Like, really, he has all the tools physically. And his on-ball defense is very good. If he can figure out the off-ball stuff and what he's talking about during these practices, talking about learning from Jamal Shead, who's a rookie, by the way, talking about learning from Emmanuel Quickly, who's younger than him, by the way, talking about being pushed by Darko. I'm hearing a guy who really, really, really wants to keep his NBA career going. And I got news for you. Davion Mitchell, Ochai Agbaji, China. If these guys don't figure it out this year, literally China next year. There's no rotation spot for these guys. Nobody cares they were lottery picks. I promise you, they will be in the G League, or they will be in Europe, or they will be in China. So the absolute urgency to figure it out for two guys who are right at the age where a lot of NBA prospects do figure it out, it could be impressive. Now, if you take the two lumps or the two types of players, the Raptors have core players. Core players include Emmanuel Quickly, long-term contract; Jakob Poeltl, long-term contract; Scotty Barnes, signed for the next 6 years; RJ Barrett, on the books for 3 years; Grady Dick, you have team control for the next 7 years. Okay, those are your core. That's your core. Everything else beyond that, find the bad contract. Find the unmovable Kem Birch, 3 years, $18 million; Chris Boucher, 3 years, $36 million. Find that contract on the books. If you're committed to the idea that Jakob Poeltl is a serviceable big for you and will either play a starting role or a heavy bench role for the next 3-4 years, and you don't have to trade him, you're happy with him, consider what you have on the books is basically a bunch of expiring contracts. Everyone's expiring. Okay. That's one part of the equation, which is your core guys and they're signed up. You obviously have your there's like 3 parts of every rotation, right? There's your key rotation, there's your deep rotation, and then there's your fringe rotation. This is how I like to think about it. Your fringe rotation is Garrett Temple, Jacoby Walter, Jamal Shead, Jonathan Mogbo. No consequence. Ulrich Shamshay, you could throw him in there. Brandon Carlson, you could throw him in there. There's your main rotation, which I just outlined. And then there is your sort of like your secondary rotation, like your bench, your core bench players. Kelly Olynyk, 2 years, $24 million. Very movable contract, very nice guy, very liked around the league, very valuable skill set as a stretch big. Any contender could use a Kelly Olynyk. Ochai Agbaji, Davion Mitchell, expiring contracts on somewhat likable, maybe someone can sell themselves on them just being good third stringers for their team. Okay. Davion Mitchell, if he's a third stringer for your team, no problem. He was a second stringer for a lot of Sacramento's success, and he performed fine. He wasn't great. He wasn't good. He was just fine. And if he becomes more than fine, well, then that contract becomes even more appealing. So you have Chris Boucher on expiring. Also, a guy with a proven track record, not a lot of value around the league yet. You've never seen him as a an $11 million expiring, though. That's 4 players. Then you got Bruce Brown, a $23 million expiring contract if I ever saw one. And the Raptors believe, or a lot of people clown, are they going to get a first round pick for it? Don't need to get a first round pick for it. I'll tell you what else they have on their roster. They have a player that nobody's talking about. You know what that player's name is? That player's name is a mid-level exception. New wrinkle in the CBA is the mid-level exception, if not used, can be traded. So, okay, that's one part of the equation that I really want you to hone in on, is that all of the guys that you don't think are good enough to be a bench are all either expirings or highly tradable. All of them. So basically, you have the Gravis Vasquez, the John Salmons, you have that poo-poo platter of assets that would typically be used to acquire something bigger. Okay. What else do you have? You have a season in which the circumstances are going to dictate some very odd stuff. The new CBA is going to landlock pretty much every single team that has exceeded the apron. Okay. Teams like New York, teams like Milwaukee, teams like Denver, teams like Minnesota. So basically, your contenders, Boston especially, these teams are not going to have a lot of flexibility in terms of moves they can create. The new CBA creates a lot of, disruption. Phoenix, if you consider them a contender, softball contender. There are a lot of teams that are in, let's say, not in a position to make the vast majority of moves that would need to be made. So they're very restricted. Then you have a bunch of teams that would not want to make a move even if you force them to. Your Brooklyn Nets, your Detroit Pistons, your Washington Wizards, your Charlotte Hornets, your Portland Trail Blazers, right? These are not teams that are going to be looking to buy the trade deadline. They're not going to be looking for a Brandon Ingram. They're not looking to absorb salary or get really good rotation players that are win now players. But these players exist. And a Cam Johnson, a player like a Cam Johnson, a player like, man, you could think of a Cam Johnson, you could think of a Denny Avdia over in Portland. These are winning players on really bad teams. Okay. Then of course you have teams like Miami that have, maybe set themselves up for a losing season and they may want to pivot. You have teams that are like Chicago, New Orleans. If there's a Zion injury and the Brandon Ingram thing holds over, you have a Milwaukee. If this Damian Lillard thing does not work out in Milwaukee, they start out low. So again, a lot of these teams will want to make moves and they may want to dump assets. They may be willing to even move off a first round pick in order to facilitate some of those deals. And the Raptors are uniquely positioned because they have a complete poo-poo platter of non-core pieces that are pretty much all expirings. And Bruce Brown plus Kelly Olynyk or Bruce Brown plus Chris Boucher pretty much gets you in the dance. Now, you may not have the most favorable opinion of trading for a player like a Brandon Ingram, but consider what Brandon Ingram would represent for you, right? If your defense is even halfway decent, Brandon Ingram's not a terrible defender. He's certainly not on the level of an RJ Barrett. Could you swap? Brandon Ingram is a massive, massive talent. He's been a first option for a large chunk of his career. First, second option. A Brandon Ingram and Scotty Barnes duo, that's something. Look, typically, you don't think that a Brandon Ingram or a Zach LaVine or a Bradley Beal, and I'm not suggesting trading for those 3 players. I'm just bringing those players up as examples. You don't typically think that those 3 players are going to be traded for a bunch of expirings. You just don't think that way. You think they're worth more. You think, well, historically, these types of players have commanded multiple picks. But the number of teams that can actually hand out multiple picks for a, disgruntled star, it's fading. It's fading into nothing, right? I think you have to look at this from the perspective of musical chairs, right? Most teams that are at the top of the contender standings have 2 very important things in common. One, Their picks are either gone or very low value. Okay, that's it's worth noting. A 2026 Toronto Raptors first rounder is worth more than a Minnesota 2026 first rounder by far. By far. Being on I guess having a bearish outlook, having the vast majority of the league look down at your future can be a very beneficial thing if in fact you have a deeper insight into your future being brighter than others expect. Now, people are very traumatized from the idea of trading first round picks. We went through this whole thing with Thaddeus Young, bad. We went through it with Jakob Pertl, really bad. But you didn't do it to support a young core. You did it to support a core that was largely anchored by Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam. But what about now? You know, the Raptors did this once before. Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, Vince Carter specifically, Morris Peterson, whatever. What did they do? They had Jonathan Bender, and they decided to trade him to Indiana for what would become Antonio Davis. They had the second overall pick in Marcus Camby, and they decided to trade him for Charles Oakley. Now, there is a certain segment of fans I'll never understand that believe that the best way to develop a winning team is just have a whole bunch of really young guys. History has shown us that that usually does not work. The vast majority of teams that become good have a good mix of veterans, young players, and very young players. There is a nice melding of that. And what the Raptors have right now, again, are a bunch of assets that can be converted into something bigger. Now, I didn't even include the possibility of maybe sweetening the pot and getting yourself at the table with an RJ Barrett. Now, what about the development of these players? Why does development matter so much? Well, I want you to look really when you have a chance, go Google the 2012 2013 Toronto Raptors. Look at that roster and tell me how that roster would become within a few years the 2018 2019 Toronto Raptors. Just try to draw a line. Now, you would probably think it included phenomenal lottery luck. It probably included a couple of first round, top 3 picks, but that's not how it happened. You know, if you look at the New York Knicks, what was it? It was a very underrated signing of Jalen Brunson that really changed their entire trajectory. Jalen Brunson, Isaiah Hartenstein, and Dante DiVincenzo. Those are all free agent signings, really smart ones too. Really underrated, very underpriced free agent signings. Teams build in different ways. The Toronto Raptors historically built through the draft, but it wasn't through top 5 picks. It really wasn't. It was through developing players. If I told you in 2011, when DeMar DeRozan was really struggling in year 2, year 3, and there were talks about, this guy's just not good enough. He's not going to be anything. I'm telling you, the where Grady is today, like how Grady is seen, that's relatively similar to how DeMar was seen. And I don't think if I told you today, Grady Dick will in 4 years be traded for a 2 times finals MVP, you would think I was insane. You'd be like, wow, he must have become a lot better. And that's what development is. It's hard to see. It's like the iceberg. That's really what it is. When you take into account how much development focus, how the culture has shifted in Toronto, you really don't really factor in that how much was lost between 2019 and 2023. Because there's a world in which guys like maybe guys that didn't work out, Terrence Davis, Jalen Harris, Malachi Flynn, Delano Banton. Shall I go on? Jonte Porter, Christian Coloco. There's so many interesting young players who had a chance, who came in here and did not receive the same type of tutelage, development, cultural integration, focus, minutes, opportunity, consistency that their predecessors received. If you isolate Fred VanVleet on draft day, Malachi Flynn on draft day. Now, whatever burns in Fred did not burn in Malachi, you could say, but it's not like Malachi Flynn just wanted to come out and to not take his NBA career seriously. It's those early grains, those early nuggets of wisdom, that early reps, right? The early messaging, the early integration of what it means to be a pro, the early examples that you see from, a DeMar DeRozan and a Kyle Lowry. It's those pats on the back. It's those bus rides, plane rides, the rookie hazings. This is what creates greatness, Really. I'm telling you, this better everyday approach is the most counterintuitive idea, and people don't get it. They just don't. And if you want evidence that people don't understand better every day, look at the average person's life. Does the average person grind every day to be 1% better? No. The average person plays the lottery. I'm telling you, it is true. I grew up in government housing. Do you know what almost every single person around me had in common? A few things. Number one, none of them took accountability for their own issues. Zilch. There was always it's the government's fault, it's my parents' fault, it's drugs' fault, it's, the politician's fault, it's the mayor's fault, it's blah, blah, blah. It's, my sister's fault, my sister's a schizophrenic, whatever. That's one thing. Number two, they all wanted a really quick fix, which is why when the welfare checks came on the first, one of the first things they did, they went down to the local convenience store and they picked up a whole bunch of scratchy lotteries. And I think, unfortunately, the vast majority of people have adopted that mentality, whether you are in government housing, whether you're broke or whatever. Unfortunately, we all have this get rich quick scheme in our minds as the blueprint for success. You become really bad for 1 year, you take for Cooper Flag, you get Cooper Flag, and now you're good. That's not how it works. That's never how it works. Look at the Detroit Pistons. They got Jaden Ivey, who was a projected top 4 pick. They got Jalen Duren, who was a projected top 6 pick. They got Asar Thompson, who's a projected top 5 pick. They got Cade Cunningham, who was the best player in the country at the time. And you can poo-poo all you want at those players now. You can. But what were those players when they drafted them? If I compare Cooper Flag versus Cade Cunningham as prospects, I can say now with the benefit of hindsight that Cooper Flag is way better. But I'll tell you right now, the hype was very similar. Did Zion Williamson change the championship odds for the Pelicans? Has he won a playoff round? Have they won a playoff round with him? What is the success? He was generational, right? He was the guy worth tanking for, right? Didn't change shit. But Dwayne Wade, the 5th pick, who was on draft day, Dwayne Wade was projected to go as low as 18th. He becomes the 5th pick, goes to Miami, wins a championship in 2 years. How'd that happen? Is it something that maybe Heat culture has been around for a while? Pat Riley understands winning culture, winning habits, accountability. Now it's not exact. It's not 100% hit rate. Even the Toronto Raptors, it's not like Terrence Ross blossomed into some sort of superstar. He didn't. John Salmons didn't work out. Lou Williams had a short stint here. This is not 100% success rate. So you can point to the failures. You can guarantee right now. I'll look down this roster and I'll tell you half these guys won't be on the team next year. Guaranteed. They won't. The point is big bets that pay off, small bets that refresh quickly. You need to have this idea that until you put people in a position to succeed, you cannot figure out if they are successful or if they can be successful. You need to create an environment where people are free to explore how good they want to be. Which means that you cannot create a high stress environment. That's one thing that I really like about Darko. And when Darko Rajakovic was hired, one of the first things I did, and I've talked about this numerous times, is I went sleuthing for research because I'm like, man, I don't think the Toronto Raptors are ever going to hire a coach from my hometown ever again. This is a very unique opportunity to get a lot of stories about this guy. And everything you heard from people was about how he just wanted you to be freer. He wanted you to relax. He wanted you to get out of your head. He wanted you to play with swagger. He wanted you to try things. He wanted to encourage failure. Dude, we can all look at every person who ever succeeded and say they were supposed to succeed. But I'll tell you that there were 100 doors and 100 outcomes in which that person did not succeed. Believe me, there is a world in which Kawhi Leonard is not a superstar. There is a world in which DeMar DeRozan is not a superstar. There is a world in which Kyle Lowry did not become the greatest Raptor of all time. It's every day. These players, there's nothing obvious. There isn't. You can take an athlete like a Gerald Green and say, he's supposed to be great. You can take a, number one ranked high school player and say, they're supposed to be great. How many number one ranked high school players have amounted to absolutely nothing? I'll tell you right now, the Toronto Raptors next year are going to draft their center of the future. He's 7'1". He plays for the Memphis Tigers. He's a 5-star recruit, widely regarded as the top big man in the country. He can block shots. He can block 8 shots in high school. He blocked 8 shots. Stop me when you understand who I'm talking about. You think Malawak? Nope. He is a motor. He runs the floor faster than almost any big I have ever seen in my life. He sprints like a gazelle. He's fluid. Shamshay. Nope. You know who I'm describing? James Wiseman. I am describing James Wiseman. Do you understand what I'm saying? James Wiseman went to an elite organization. Steph Curry, Steve Kerr, championship pedigree, and failed. Then he went to the Detroit Pistons, failed. He's gone to the Indiana Pacers. He will fail again. There you go. You can really psych yourself up about Kaman Malwak, VJ Edgecombe. You can psych yourself up about the potential of Dylan Harper. I'll tell you right now, Dylan Harper is nowhere near the player Emmanuel Quickley is right now. You will have to develop him too. You will have to develop a Cooper Flag. If Scotty Barnes and Cooper Flag played a game right now in which they had identical rosters and they were the best players on each roster, I think Scotty Barnes' team would win 100-45. The gap is enormous between where these kids are and where they have to get to. And it's very easy when kids are 17, 18 to say, oh, it's obvious. It's obvious. It's never obvious. It's never fucking obvious. Joe Smith was supposed to be the best player in the league. Chris Webber was supposed to be the best player in the league. That was the hype. I promise you it was the hype. Grant Hill was supposed to be the next Michael Jordan. Now, granted, Grant Hill was amazing. Injuries took it away. Vince Carter was supposed to be the next Michael Jordan. Didn't happen. Kobe Bryant was not supposed to be the next Michael Jordan, dude. He was a 13th overall pick. People thought he was too skinny. DeMar DeRozan was certainly not supposed to be, a 6-time All-Star. Kyle Lowry was certainly never supposed to be an All-Star. We need to stop talking about young players like they're absolutes. They are not absolutes. These things are always in flux. And here's the thing. Y'all want a high lottery pick? Great. So do I. I'm not lying. VJ Edgecombe would be fun to cover. Dylan Harper would be really interesting. Ace Bailey? Wow. That'd be interesting. Cooper Flag? Dream come true. Great. Next year, AJ DeBonsa, I'll buy the jersey on draft night. But when that player comes, there will exist a certain percentage chance that they will fail. And there will exist a certain percentage chance that they will succeed. And what you need to do as an organization is tilt the odds in your favor that every single player that comes in is 10% more likely to succeed than had they gone somewhere else. That is the best you can do. 10%. How do you do that? How the Raptors are doing it right now. You take away the anxiety. Grady Dix talked about anxiety. Jacoby Walter talked about not wanting to make mistakes in summer league. That's anxiety. That's performance anxiety. You know how quickly a coach can absolutely kill a player's confidence? Do you know how easily a player can start to feel lost in the shuffle? Do you know how easily a player can get caught up in the wrong circles, the wrong things without the proper guidance, proper mentorship, proper veterans in the locker room? Y'all shit on Garrett Temple. Not y'all, but some people shit on the idea. Why are we wasting a roster spot on Garrett Temple? Why do we have Kelly Olynyk? He's too old for this core. We should have. You don't get it. Organizations don't work this way. No successful organization has ever succeeded without mentorship. No person who is ever successful has succeeded without mentorship. So how do you expect a 19-year-old, that you think is the great white hope in Cooper Flag to come in and do what? Him and Scotty Barnes are going to teach a whole bunch of, other 19 and 20-year-olds how to be a superstar? That's not how it works. That's never how it works. And unfortunately, so many of these players, like a Ja Morant, right? A Zion Williamson, oh, they can escalate themselves to all-star level because they're just that talented. But will they ever hit their maximum their maximum output? Would Vince have become who he became in 2001, 2002? Listen to him talk about those years without Antonio Davis, without Kevin Willis, without Muggsy Bogues. Could he have done it without Butch Carter, who was a phenomenal development coach, for the record? Shout outs to Butch. Could he have done it without Doug Christie? Could he have done it without those guys? I don't think so. So when you trade away a draft pick in order to boost that, there is a trade-off here. A Kelly Olynyk, again, consider this. On the one side of it, you have Kelly Olynyk and Jakob Poeltl. Okay, these are phenomenal bigs with incredible depth, incredible IQ, who are great teachers of the game. They're great communicators. They're phenomenal, and they're very team first. They're very team first. They're very friendly, and they give value back. Like they see themselves as mentors. They see that as a relationship. On the other side of the equation, you have Jonathan Mogbo and Yuri Shamshay, two bigs who have a lot to learn about the pro game, right? On the one side, you have Jacoby Walter, RJ Barrett, Grady Dick, young, athletic, full of potential guards, right? Guards, wings, right? On the other side of the equation, you have a guy like Bruce Brown, right? Garrett Temple. Now, the way an average fan, at least from the discussions that I've seen, looks at this equation as these guys are in the way of that guy, but they're not. These are veterans that are very much over themselves. Bruce Brown is not trying to be an all-star. You see, when you run into problems, it's when you have people who really haven't accepted who they are yet. Like a Fred VanVleet or a Pascal Siakam are still like they're in their prime. They're not really. I'm not saying they're not giving guidance. They're just competing. They're not here in a mentorship position, right? You can watch them, you can observe them, they can become friends with you, but they're at the end of the day, they're still about they're still about their bag, their career. When you have guys who are past that point, then those guys are just giving back. Kevin Willis did not come to Toronto to be a superstar. Antonio Davis did not come to Toronto to be a superstar. Charles Oakley did not come to Toronto to be a superstar. Their role was clear: to nurture Vince, to teach him how to be a pro, to protect him on the court, to set great screens for him, and to elevate him. And really, that's what you need. So while you see, on the one hand, you have these older guys like Kelly and Jakob, and on the other hand, you have these super young guys who need minutes, and you might even be upset. You might even be upset that Jakob is playing over Ulrich, especially if Ulrich is ahead of schedule, or you might be upset that Kelly is getting minutes ahead of Jonathan. But understand that this is an iceberg, that what you don't see is the play groups. What you don't see is Garrett Temple teaching Jacoby Walter how to come off the screen. What you're not seeing is that Grady Dick is struggling and Bruce Brown is like, "Hey, come over here." What you don't see is the Otto Porter. Everyone considers Otto Porter such a disaster for the Raptors. I think he was such a great teacher behind the scenes. Every young player has credited Otto with how much of a veteran he was and how much of a presence he was. So we need to see these things differently. Now, obviously, you and I can disagree on how much these players should be paid for their tutelage and veteran leadership role, but these guys are still, they have families. You want to pay them. You want to pay them well. You want them to be happy. And ultimately, you do want them to play. You want them to play because that is the natural progression of things. It's very different to be outside the rotation and trying to help guys. You could say, well, why can't we just, we have Garrett Temple. Why can't we just hire him as a coach? It's a totally different dynamic. It's a totally different dynamic. If you've ever played sports, you understand that the coaches are separated from the players, right? So, long and short, what am I trying to say? We fundamentally misunderstand development. We fundamentally massively overrate the sureness of prospects. I've had an issue with this my whole life. I really and also we underrate the impact of culture. Okay? Now, Darko Rajakovic has taken a lot of slings last year for his defense. Oh, he doesn't know how to he doesn't know how to teach defense. You telling me someone who's coached for nearly 30 years on various professional levels, someone who reads as much as he does, doesn't understand how to coach defense. If this year, and this is where some very smart people unfortunately miss the forest from the trees because you can track data. You can track data. It's laboring, it's time intensive, but you can do it. You can track every Grady shot, you can track every RJ possession. You can track every Scotty Barnes pick and roll. It doesn't mean you understand why and what is happening on the court. You can track it all. You can say, oh, well, Grady shot, 47% on this pull up and whatever. It doesn't mean anything because what you don't realize is they forced him to go left instead of right because that was the uncomfortable zone for him, or his screener was not as good as Jakob Pertl, and so those percentages are affected. There's so much going on a basketball court. It requires so much depth of knowledge, and so often when you talk to trainers, when you talk to scouts, there is just a layer. It is very iceberg. Like we all see the surface. We all see Cooper Flag good, draft picks good. Carl Anthony Towns really good. What we don't see is the bottom. What we don't see is the flexibility. We don't see the culture. We don't see the locker room. We don't see the impact to team culture. We don't see the leadership. We don't see the intangibles. We don't see, the grit and how that player's mood and moodiness affects the locker room. We don't see the chemistry and how important chemistry is to on-court success. What we, again, I'll frame it back to something that I read, during the pandemic that really changed my life, which is a book called Atomic Habits. And Atomic Habits is basically all about 1% better, all about it. They talks about, optimizing sleep by 2%, optimizing, someone's water intake, optimizing, the it's the smallest things. And we are unfortunately just not accustomed to seeing those small things. So if Urish becomes good, very little of him becoming good will ever be analyzed. Kelly will get almost no credit. Darko will get almost no credit. Jama will get almost no credit. It'll be broad brushed as the Raptors developed him, but that development will never be fully understood. And if he fails, the failure of development will also never be understood. Delano Banton was a bum. Malachi Flynn was a bum. These guys just become it's too complicated. And sometimes when things are so complicated, when there's 85 different factors that contributed to a particular outcome, we are so accustomed to trying to broad brush and oversimplify things. But I'm encouraging you to overcomplicate things for a moment, just so you can understand them. Now, the Raptors rebuild is ahead of schedule. Why do I think it's ahead of schedule? Because clearly the Raptors, as constructed, are gearing up for what is probably a 30-win season and, no Cooper Flag and no playoffs, right? That is a more likely outcome because, media day is so funny. It's so optimistic, right? I got a friend, Leo, he's tracking all the Sacramento stuff and they're talking about Western Conference Finals and that team is more likely to miss the playoffs than it is to make the Western Conference Finals, in my honest opinion. But hey, that's Leo's take, and that's I don't want to say that's Leo's take, but that's the internal confidence. Eric Spoelstra talking about there's no faith, and our guys are hurt by last year. What happened? It's not going to change Jimmy Butler's stance on his contract. The fact that he has a contract extension looming. No team at this point, very few teams at this point, are out of the race. They all have the hope that, well, maybe some miracle is going to turn us into a 47-win team or whatever that. But the truth is, the vast majority of these teams, they just simply don't have the maneuverability of the Toronto Raptors. They just don't. Okay, they have contracts like Tobias Harris that no one's touching with a 10-foot pole. They have bloated contracts at the end. Maybe they've depleted their draft picks. Maybe they don't want to be good. Maybe they don't have a superstar. The Raptors have all of these ingredients, because what you need, honestly, what you need right now, like let's be real. Let's take account of what the Raptors really have. They have an all-star in Scotty Barnes, and they have what I consider two sub all-stars in RJ and Emmanuel Quickly. Yes, I have gotten way higher on RJ Barrett after watching him with Team Canada and watching him with the Raptors. I really do believe that this guy is a defensive uplift away from being like a really good player. Okay. All-star? No. Sub-all-star? Sure. Because Emmanuel Quickly is talking about becoming an all-star. RJ's talking about becoming an all-star. So obviously these guys are scratching on the surface of being 20-plus point per game scorers who can be reasonably efficient, can handle a decent creation load, and can also potentially defend. And with RJ, Again, the defense is a bigger question mark than with Emmanuel Quickly. I think Emmanuel Quickly will have a better defensive season this year now that he's a little bit more situated. He's gotten a lot stronger. So that's what you have. So what you need these guys to do is level up 5%. 5%. And I believe that that level up is very, very much in the realm of possibilities. Then what you have, what I described in the conversation with Vince that I hadn't really thought about and just sort of found the thought was, hey, all of us are talking about the Toronto Raptors having this really, really terrible schedule and how they're going to tear it down all down if they start out 3-17 or whatever. But a team with this type of chemistry will not start 3-17. They just won't. There's too much professional pride here. There's too many good players. And even if you can argue that they probably should start 6-14 or something of that sort, because you look at a Denver, you're like, they're going to lose to Denver. You look at a Minnesota, you're like, they're going to lose to Minnesota. They're going to lose to the Lakers. They're going to lose to the Clippers. Why? Why is that for sure? Because chemistry very often dictates results in the NBA. You see these teams that are really like not very good teams and they go through these stretches and they're very good for like 2 weeks or something. And unfortunately, wins and losses are how we account for how good a team is in the NBA. We often say a 60 win team is better than a 47 win team. What we don't understand is that a lot of, I don't want to say 60 win teams, but a lot of 47 win teams maybe surprise some people and caught some people napping, right? The scouting report wasn't out on them. They implemented a new offense. They caught some people sleeping because they had a new coach. They introduced a new offense, and there just isn't enough data. And when there isn't enough data about a particular team or a particular, you can catch some people napping early. And sometimes what we don't account for is that teams are different at different stages. And this is something we talked about in that conversation with Vince. It's very easy to say, well, you're supposed to lose against Denver, but you don't understand where Denver is usually in October, November. They're gearing up. Uh, they're barely in shape. Nikola Jokic has probably been relaxing for like the last month. So he's just like he had a tough summer. He's gearing up for a 9-month season. Jamal Murray had a tough summer with Team Canada. He has injuries, just got his contract signed. Jamal Murray is a notorious slow starter. Michael Porter Jr., I don't know where his head's at right now. Who knows? His family has gone through a lot over the last 6 months. Is it possible to beat Denver? Yeah, on paper, it looks impossible. I'm telling you that game's like a 40-60 to me. And there's a lot of 40-60 games because, again, you're the Toronto Raptors. You're going to catch everyone sleeping. You have the element of surprise. Okay. You could go 5-0 in the preseason and no one is gearing up for the Toronto Raptors. There's no person on this team. There's not even a Pascal Siakam and an OG and an OB where you're like, oh, that could be a tough grind. No, this team is a joke. For the most of the league and most of the analysts out there, most teams probably think that this team is going to be a joke. And so you're going to catch some teams sleeping early. And then, of course, if you end up starting out 12-8, now teams have some more scouting on the offense that you're running, the defense that you're running, and that now they can be. But what benefits the Toronto Raptors is the hardest part of their schedule is the first 25 games. After that, you have a lot of clear sailing and a lot of tanking. So right now, you have a lot of teams like Charlotte, Washington, Detroit that we all assume are going to be terrible. What about teams that we don't think are going to be terrible right now, but we'll find out they're terrible through the first 20 games because they have an injury, and then we'll decide to pivot and try to tank for Cooper Flag, right? There's some teams that can't tank. The Atlanta Hawks don't have their own pick. They can't tank, right? Again, I think that there is so much to say about how good the Raptors could be this season because the ingredients are there. The chemistry is there. The chemistry is the one big, when you look at teams that have overachieved, the three teams that I described, 06, 07 Raptors, they had in unbelievable chemistry. Unbelievable. Everyone loved each other. Jorge Garbajosa was such a great mentor for Andrea Bargnani. That entire vibe of that team. Anthony Parker was super light. Jose Calderon, like that, Jose Calderon and TJ Ford, like Chris Bosh was actually taking on a leadership role. Like that team was just so perfectly assembled. Like the sum was greater than the parts. When you look at the 13-14 Raptors with John Salmons and a super motivated Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan, it was all chemistry, man. It was all chemistry. That team just came together. It came together. They were kind of rallying against management. So like they tried to trade Kyle Lowry. They traded Rudy Gay. Fuck these guys. We're gonna spite them and win. And they just came together and they found lightning in a bottle, right? The 21-22 Raptors, same thing, man. Precious Achua, Scotty Barnes, the vibes were immaculate, right? Fred VanVleet, all-star season. Like it was all coming together. Everything came together. Scotty was ahead of schedule. Gary was splashing threes. Precious was hitting threes from the corner. Thaddeus Young came in and just, the ownership, the management showed faith in that in that roster. It just came together. And that's what I'm telling you. Chemistry is everything. And the Toronto Raptors have it. They have chemistry. And when you look at a team that did not perform to expectations, look the next year. Scotty's second year. That team was very heavy, energetically heavy. Team not communicating, a lot of bad body language. This stuff matters. Defense is like 80% communication, 20% personnel. When we're talking NBA level defense, you can make almost any team league average defensively if you have even remotely the personnel to do it. And trust me, the Raptors have the personnel to be a top 20 defense. They don't need to be bottom. They don't need to be at the bottom in defense. So again, you prioritize development, you prioritize culture, you prioritize accountability, you prioritize the mantra of being 1% better every day. And at some point, you realize that 1% every day, it's like compound interest. It adds up. And I got news for you. The Raptors didn't start training camp this week. They started training camp pretty much 4 months ago. They've been working at this all summer. Because as much as you want to say this is year one of a rebuild, there's nothing that says a rebuild must be a losing season. And that is where I think terms are being conflated and things are being called things that they are not. The word rebuild does not mean losing. It does not mean losing. It means establishing. Think about what I'm saying. If I say I'm rebuilding my room or I'm rebuilding my house, does that imply that I'm destroying my house? No. Does that imply that my house will be a wreck a year from now? No. You don't know how fast I'm going to rebuild. The rebuild, colloquially, has been used as a term to describe a team that is going to be bad, but that's tanking. Tanking and rebuilding are not synonymous. They're not the same thing. Tanking means we're going to be deliberately bad. Rebuilding means we're implementing new shit. And when you are implementing a new offense with a whole bunch of young players and you're prioritizing their development over winning, it does not mean that their development and winning cannot overlap. It does not mean that in the process of trying to force, a player to go, I don't know, consider RJ Barrett. Like RJ Barrett was a mid-range guy. Like he just wanted to be a mid-range guy. But now he's a three-point guy. He's cut out a lot of the mid-range stuff. Emmanuel Quickly. You wanted to get him away from some of the floater range stuff. You wanted to make him a lot more proficient as a pick and roll ball handler. Well, that's technically development and rebuilding. But isn't he just really good at that stuff now? Like, what if he's just really good at that? What if the increased size and weight on Quickly and then just the shoulder strength is what was the difference between him in New York and him all-star season? I'll tell you right now, if Emmanuel Quickly and Scotty Barnes are both all-stars this year, you're going to have a really, really tough time losing more than 40 games. Trust me, especially if they're healthy. Health is going to factor so much into this. Trades are going to factor so much into this. Now, really, to cap this off, the part that I mentioned earlier about all these tradable contracts, trust me, everything that is not of great consequence is very easy to trade. Hey, for super chat here from Slitherman. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Everything that is not of great consequence is easily shuffleable. Shuffleable is not a word, but I'm just saying you can part it out, right? Your Terrence Ross plus I think 1 first round pick for Serge Ibaka, that trade can be done again. So as it's currently structured, when I look at the Toronto Raptors, here's what I see. I see a starting point guard in Emmanuel Quickly. I see a starting wing and a future superstar who will probably get there sooner rather than later in Scotty Barnes. I see a starting center who is maybe in the lower half in terms of average starting centers in the NBA in Jakob Poeltl. I see elite movement shooting, and I see a great prioritization towards point of attack defense and three-point shooting, things that are known to work. I see a coaching staff that has greatly emphasized basketball IQ, development of basketball IQ, implementation of selfless basketball, and good habits that are proven to work. I also see a coach that is taking a very European approach to development, which is a lot of 3-on-3 stuff. When Raptors describe playgroups, they say like, "Oh, we had playgroups, whatever." 3-on-3 is really like a secret. I don't understand why more American players don't do it, but like 3-on-3 is just really great for honing in on development. And I think like Eric and I talked about this, that in Europe they do a lot of that, and it is very beneficial to developing basketball IQ and good good situations in that sense. Now, the ability to guard your man, the high pickup point, the emphasis of the MIG, Darko Rajakovic in his opening day presser, in media day, said, our MIG is the guy who has the ball. This is preaching accountability, but this is also forcing growth in that regard. And whether you want to admit it or not, individual defense, holding players accountable, is going to matter. Now, Jacoby Walter was unfortunately injured when Scotty Barnes closed out on him super hard. But I think the final thing that I'll say is teams tend to go in the direction that their best player goes. Whatever your best player prioritizes, that's usually the cultural identity of your team. If your best player is a hard worker, if your best player is selfless, if your best player is very defensively oriented, that's usually going to be how you win. And that's why when Masai Ujiri says, we already knocked out the hardest thing, the best play, like we got that guy in Scotty Barnes. Well, I want you to think about this. When were the Raptors most successful? Throughout history, when have they been the most successful? Well, they were the most successful under Kyle Lowry because you had a leader who really embodied everything you need to win. Selflessness, he loved his teammates, he cared about his teammates. Defense, he was a small things king. He valued screen setting, he valued loose balls, he dove for the ball. That set the culture. But guess what? Prior to him being elevated to that spot, he wasn't your best player. Chris Bosh was your best player. Then Andrea Bargnani was your best player. Then Rudy Gay was your best player. It wasn't until Kyle was given that top spot that his imprint on the team really came to fruition. And then you had Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet. And I think Fred VanVleet values a lot of the stuff that requires to win, but I don't necessarily think he was the best player on the team ever. I think it was Pascal's team. So what does Pascal value? I don't consider Pascal Siakam a great small things guy. I very rarely saw Pascal Siakam diving for loose balls or being a great screener or, the attention to detail and a lot of stuff. Pascal Siakam was a skills guy. He was an elite transition guy, but he wasn't the leader. He wasn't preaching all the same stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Like Tim Duncan, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. Like, these are surgical guys who really care about defense. They care about winning. They care about, championships. Like, that's their whole thing. Well, Scotty, his whole MO is winning championships. He brushed off any talk about all NBA, even though there's contract implications to that, because he said if you win, everything takes care of itself. When your leader is talking about winning and defense, when your leader is that dude that we remember in Florida State who was like picking up full court and trying to harass guards, when that's your leader, when your leader is grabbing, and screaming and infusing you with energy, man, I'm telling you, there is a chance that this team is strangely good. And it just feels like right now, what's really holding them back is two things. And basically, both those things can be very easily addressed. Very easily addressed. Number one is probably a really good point of attack defender in the starting lineup to shield some of the burden from Scotty and RJ and Emmanuel quickly. So basically, KCP. Something like that. Something of that sort, right? The idealized version of Ochai Abaji. Like, that's what's really missing from that starting lineup. Because right now, as I see it, maybe the defense at best with Grady, or if Grady develops, if he has developed, right, the way I think he can, I think he can be a league average defender. I think Emmanuel quickly is slightly above average. RJ can at most be a little bit below average. Scotty and okay, so maybe the starting lineup has just enough defense, and maybe this defense will be not the central focus because there's nobody on this team that has quite the defensive impact of an OG Anunoby and a Fred VanVleet. But let's assume for a second that offense is more important than defense. Offense will always have more trade value. And so maybe at some point you can trade, something for Herb Jones or, something of that sort. So ultimately, what the Raptors really need is, in my opinion, massive rim protection and paint finishing off the bench. Clint Capella? I don't know. Something of that sort. A really good rotation big off the bench, right? Who can cover up for some of the stuff with Kelly. Could a Walker Kessler be the answer off the bench for the Raptors? Allegedly, Utah is willing to move off of him. What would it take? Would Davion Mitchell and a first round pick get you Walker Kessler? Are you willing to move off that Indiana pick? Is it enough? Because he solves a lot of problems for you. I'll tell you that. He may have a lot of offensive deficiencies, but rim protection is an MO for him. That's one thing. The second thing you need is a really good sixth man initiator. Now I understand Scotty's going to play some spot minutes at point for the backup unit, and that's going to force some development. But you either need like Jamal Shead or Jacoby Walter to take a quantum leap this year, which is probably not going to happen, or you need to trade for that. And I think that's what you need. I think that's it. That's all you need, right? I think you could probably accomplish some of this. The starting lineup thing I think can be accomplished with Cam Johnson. I really do. I think if you trade Bruce Brown for Cam Johnson, it solves a ton of problems, right? Even if you have to move off of a couple of seconds and maybe even a first for it, I think it solves a ton of problems because Cam is pretty fairly paid. Cam slides over at the 4, Scotty moves to the 2, and suddenly, or the 3, and you go from like when you replace a Grady Dick with a Cam Johnson in the starting lineup, you basically go from like, oh, maybe there'll be a league average defense to they could be a top 10 defense. That's the gap, right? Because you go from having to compensate for from two bad defenders in RJ and Grady to just one. At some point, I'm pretty sure the Raptors will move off of one of RJ or Grady. I'm like when I'm envisioning the championship year, whenever that comes, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years down the line, I don't think both those guys are gonna be on this team. But at the end, that's what development is for. You are developing assets because right now you have your core. Your core is movable. Terrence Ross was a part of the core in 2013, 2014. Was he not? He got shipped out for Serge Ibaka, and then Serge Ibaka became part of the core. Jonas Valanciunas was a part of the core in 2013, 2014. He was a big part of We the North Part 1. JV, winning, baby. He got traded for Marc Gasol. DeMar DeRozan was the pioneer of We the North. He was the face of We the North, along with Kyle Lowry. DeMar got traded. You develop these assets, you move them when necessary, you get 1% better every single day, but don't ignore the role of veterans and the role of development and the role of culture in really establishing the type of championship pedigree that you need. And regardless of whether you are for VJ Edgecombe or Ace Bailey or Dylan Harper or Cooper Flagg coming to Toronto, or whether you're more in the, I don't know, we could get some great value at 15 or 17 or 18, whatever, wherever we draft next year. I'm telling you right now, we have 5 draft picks in the next 2 drafts. I'll tell you right now, that's a tremendous, tremendous asset coming down the line. And whatever depth that you think that you're missing right now, you'll be able to fill it with those draft picks. But I don't expect the Raptors to use all those draft picks. I think at some point they're going to decide that they're ahead of schedule and they're probably going to trade 1 or 2 of those draft picks. And they're going to go for a young piece that fits this core. Whatever your goal is for this team, whatever you're rooting for lottery balls, you're rooting for wins, you're rooting for playoffs. Whoever comes into this team next year, whoever comes into this team in 2026, when you have 2 first round picks and a second round pick, so you have 3 draft picks that year in a really loaded draft. The next 2 drafts are loaded. Those young kids are going to come into this team and they're going to learn what it means to be a Raptor. They're going to learn what it means to be a professional. They're going to learn what it means to be in Toronto. They're going to learn who their coaches are. They're going to embrace being a Raptor. They're going to benefit from all these building blocks that the Raptors are putting together right now. All of it. So, again, maybe this is redundant. Maybe this didn't need to be said. But I feel so much doom and gloom around Toronto Raptor land right now where people don't understand, like, how can Jakob Pertl say this and, the team is not on the same page and we need lottery picks and we need draft. Trust me, if I tell you right now that the 13th pick in next year's draft is going to be better than the fifth pick, it's happened most times. I'd almost say that the odds of the 13th pick being better than the fifth pick are like, it's like, how many great 13th picks have there been? How many great 15th picks? You know what they all have in common? They had to develop. Devin Booker did not come out of the box ready to play. He had to develop, right? Donovan Mitchell, Davion Mitchell, they're all examples of development hell or development progress. And at some point, what the Raptors found out probably took too long to find out. A lot of us were ahead of it, is that you can't stop developing. You can't stop nurturing those habits and you cannot lose your culture. And what we are finding out now, and what we found out the entire way through with NBA history, is that culture starts at the top. It starts with your head coach. It starts with your coaching staff, your training staff, but it really starts with your star player. And I'm telling you right now, Scotty Barnes is not coming to the season to lose. He is not talking about losing. He's not acting like he's heading into a losing season. Sometimes you can tell. I really feel like sometimes on media day you can tell that there's no belief, right? Scotty Barnes has a gift, which is he is completely delusional. Delusional. He marked himself off as rookie of the year coming into a season in which Cade, Evan Mobley, Jalen Suggs, all these guys were more highly touted. He was supposed to be a project. He put win rookie of the year down on his fucking list and sent it to Brian. This is a guy who does not lack confidence, and he's going to breed that confidence into people, but he's also a guy who preaches the right stuff. You have a coach, a GM, a president, and a star player who are all on the same page. That alignment is almost requisite, is almost required for an upset season. The Raptors are going to be a Cinderella team. I just feel it. I feel it in my gut. I've gone back and forth on this many times. There are some days where I wake up and I'm like, I think this is going to be like a 30-win team and fuck, it sucks. And then there's some days that I'm like, nah, man, this team is setting up for a surprise. And of course, when I saw that schedule, I was like, oh, okay, well, here you go. Here you go. The Raptors are cursed. But I'm like, man, could this curse really be a blessing in disguise? You let me know in the comments below. I'll catch y'all later. And let's get to some quick comments. What would it take to get Nickeil Alexander-Walker from Minnesota? Probably a first round pick. You also have to consider, and let me give you a bonus for any of the 200 plus of you who've stuck around to the end. Restricted free agency is a thing. Okay? Like, it's a real thing. And money is not growing on trees for these teams. Like, the cost of being over the top, like with the expenses on your salary, are just, it's going to become such a, I'm not choosing my words very carefully here. I think that it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these teams that have a lot of budding talent to retain all of their budding talent in the new CBA. I believe the Raptors are very well situated to rise when a lot of teams are falling. I think the 5-year window for this team, or the 5-year projection for this team, is it includes a lot of scavenger hunting. So you'll have teams that are massively over that are going to look to get under because they have contracts and they cannot resign both players. You see what OKC just did with Isaiah Hartenstein, right? They got a starting level center, a really good one in that, for free. They just paid him because they were under the cap and the Knicks could not afford to pay him. You took, for instance, an Alex Caruso for a Josh Giddey. Yeah, that's the type of deal. You got one of the best perimeter defenders in the league in his prime for a young player who just simply did not work with your core anymore, that you spent 2 years developing, and now he's off to the next team. So my point is that at some point, teams like Detroit are going to have to make they're going to have to make some choices on Asar Thompson, Jaden Ivey, etc. And they may choose to dump some of these players too. And I'm not saying any of these players are world beaters, but you have teams that have an abundance of young talent that is coming up for extension soon, and they're going to get really pricey really quickly. And the Raptors may be players in restricted free agency as well. At that point, they may also be able to facilitate moves because of their, copious number of draft picks. Like the Raptors have 5 draft picks in the next 2 years, but they also own all their draft picks beyond that. So again, if there is a 4 draft picks plus salary for a star type of deal out there, for the first time in a long time, the Raptors are one of the best teams, most situated teams to do that. You can always say the OKC Thunder are going to be ahead of everybody. The Spurs have a ton of wiggle room. But if you look at the future of the league, is there any team in the East that really scares you? Is there any team in the East that's like, oh man, they're going to be a problem for years to come? You can look at Orlando. I'm not scared, right? Because I really do feel like a lot of their lift and a lot of their value is coming from players that are not necessarily part of their core going forward. Like Jonathan Isaac. I'm a very big Jonathan Isaac fan. I think he's doing a lot of heavy lifting for them. You can look at the Chicago Bulls team, I guess. Montes Buzelis. You can look at that youth team. You can look at Atlanta, Jalen Johnson, Zachary Reese-Shea. We talked about all these teams in the previous video when we broke down the entire East, which you're free to check out. The first hour of it is basically talking about the Eastern Conference. The next 2 hours of the last video were just me and Vince shooting the shit about the Raptors, and then eventually movies and music. But I think that at some point you're gonna have a place where the Toronto Raptors are going to have this ability to cash in some of these assets. And you're gonna have a lot of teams that are desperate to sell. And again, the Indiana Pacers got an all NBA player for Bruce Brown and 3 not very good picks because they waited. They were scavengers. They situated themselves. That our loss would be their gain. I think the Raptors are perfectly situated to make a deal like that, especially if they acquire another first round pick, especially if Jonathan Mogbo or Jacoby Walter actually flash some real potential. What if Grady Dick comes out and he's like a real, sniper, right? And suddenly his value just explodes the roof and every team is just licking their chops like, shit, I really want this guy off our bench. He could be a key piece. Is Grady Dick suddenly worth 3 first round picks or 2 first round picks? It's all optimistic. You can say it's overly optimistic, but I think far too many people have been overly pessimistic about the Toronto Raptors. And I'm just taking the opposite approach because, as history has taught us, the Raptors always go the other way. I'll talk to y'all later. Have a good one. Peace.